There is a switch. You will not find it in any procurement document. No Canadian politician publicly named it. No Pentagon briefing ever described it in plain language. But it exists. Built into the architecture of the most advanced fighter jet ever manufactured. Embedded inside the software, the data pipelines, the sustainment systems, the weapons authorization protocols. And it belongs to Washington, not Ottawa. For 50 years, Canada flew American jets, bought American weapons, and operated inside American-controlled defense systems. Nobody called it dependency. They called it partnership. They called it interoperability. They called it the natural arrangement between allies who share a continent and a common interest. Then the cost review landed. $8 billion added to a contract Canada had not yet signed. And somewhere inside that number, a different question surfaced. One that had never been seriously asked before. If Canada cannot update its own aircraft software without American approval, if Canada cannot integrate a new weapon without Washington's authorization, if Canada cannot access its own mission data without flowing it through foreign-controlled pipelines, then who is actually flying these jets? That question did not stay quiet, and Washington's answer to it exposed something 50 years of alliance politics had carefully buried. Canada protects the second largest airspace on Earth. Say that again slowly. The second largest. Larger than Russia's defended territory. Larger than the entire European theater. Stretching from the Great Lakes to the Arctic Ocean, from the Pacific approaches to the Atlantic corridor, across frozen terrain where infrastructure does not exist and weather does not negotiate. Russian bomber flights near Canadian approaches have increased every year for the past decade. The polar route, once theoretical, now operational, is gaining strategic weight faster than any public NATO briefing acknowledges. Arctic sovereignty is no longer a future problem. It is a present one. And Canada has been defending it with aircraft that entered service in 1982. The CF-18 replacement was never a question of whether. It was always a question of when. And more importantly, what. For years, the answer was settled before the question was finished. The F-35, Lockheed Martin. American platform. American software. American sustainment ecosystem. The procurement process had been moving in that direction so long that questioning it felt almost procedurally unnecessary. Washington had written the ending. Ottawa was expected to sign the last page. Then Prime Minister Mark Carney ordered a reassessment, not because the F-35 is a weak aircraft. It is not. The F-35 is arguably the most capable fighter jet in human history. Stealth characteristics that make it nearly invisible to conventional radar. Sensor fusion that processes battlefield data faster than any pilot can consciously track. Electronic warfare capabilities that can suppress entire enemy air defense networks before a single missile is fired. In a high-end peer conflict against a technologically sophisticated adversary, it has no equal. But capability is not the only variable in a procurement decision. Control is. And here is what the F-35's capability package quietly contains alongside everything else. Every software update Canada would ever need requires American authorization before it can be installed. Every new weapon system Canada wants to integrate onto its jets requires Washington's approval before the integration begins. Mission data. The intelligence gathered by Canadian pilots flying Canadian patrols over Canadian territory, flows through data pipelines architecturally controlled by the United States government. Sustainment contracts, upgrade schedules, operational parameters, all of it managed from outside Canada's borders, all of it dependent on a political relationship that, as the past 3 years have demonstrated with considerable clarity, is not immune to pressure, tariffs, threats, or the particular temperament of whoever currently occupies the White House. Ottawa would be flying the jets. Washington would be holding the keys. That is not a partnership. That is a subscription. And Canada just received a notification that the price was going up by $8 billion. Sweden's offer landed in that exact moment. Saab put numbers on the table that were structurally impossible to dismiss. Operating costs of $8,600 per flight hour against the F-35's $44,000. Not a marginal difference. Not a rounding adjustment. a five-fold gap that compounds across 20 years, across tens of thousands of flight hours, across an entire generation of defense budgeting, into a figure that fundamentally changes what Canada can afford to build, maintain, and deploy everywhere else. But the operating cost was only the entry point. The JAS-39 Gripen was not engineered for ideal conditions. Sweden did not design this aircraft for pristine runways, uninterrupted satellite networks, and deep logistical support chains operating at full capacity. Sweden designed it for the assumption that all of those things would be gone within the first 72 hours of any serious conflict. Air bases targeted and cratered. Command networks severed. Centralized fuel and maintenance infrastructure destroyed before the second wave of strikes arrives. Sweden built the Gripen for that cold-soaked reality, and built it so well that the aircraft became something the F-35 doctrine never needed to become: survivable without permission. A ground crew of 5, 10 minutes, refueled, rearmed, back in the air. No specialized maintenance bay, no permanent runway required. Gripen pilots trained to launch from highway strips, from improvised surfaces, from locations an adversary's targeting system never calculated as a threat axis. The philosophy embedded in every system, every design choice, every operational doctrine attached to this aircraft is the same. Dispersion defeats destruction. Resilience outlasts perfection. Against that, the F-35's dependency is not a flaw. It is a design choice that reflects a specific strategic assumption: that the support architecture will survive, that the satellites will stay up, that the data links will hold, that the sustainment chain will remain intact under pressure. Canada's Arctic geography does not share that assumption. 12,600 jobs, full technology transfer, complete national control over software, weapons integration, mission data, upgrade cycles, and operational decisions. No foreign authorization required before a Canadian pilot makes a choice over Canadian airspace. Saab embedded all of that inside a single proposal. Industry Minister Melanie Joly framed it with precision. Defense spending must deliver national security and domestic industrial benefits simultaneously, not sequentially, not as competing priorities, simultaneously. Saab's offer did exactly that, and did not ask Canada to choose between sovereignty and capability in exchange. Washington's reaction confirmed every calculation Ottawa had quietly completed. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra delivered the warning without diplomatic softening. A reduced F-35 purchase would force NORAD restructuring. American fighters would need to increase patrol operations inside Canadian airspace to compensate for the capability gap. The message required no interpretation. Choose the Gripen, and the United States expands its operational military presence over Canadian soil. Pause on that for exactly one moment. An ally threatened to increase its own military footprint inside a partner nation's territory as a consequence of that partner exercising its sovereign right to choose its own defense equipment. That is not the language of partnership. That is the language of a system that had mistaken tolerance for consent and was now recalibrating after discovering the difference. It arrived simultaneously with tariff threats against European partners over disputes entirely unrelated to defense procurement. The pattern underneath both moves was identical and unmistakable. Economic leverage and military cooperation had never been separate instruments. They had always been components of the same pressure system. Ottawa had simply reached the point where saying that out loud was more useful than continuing to pretend otherwise. When Washington issued those warnings, it was not operating from strength. Strong powers do not threaten restructuring before a contract is signed. Strong powers do not route diplomatic pressure through back channels when they are confident in the outcome. Washington was speaking from the specific and measurable fear that Canada was about to prove something the entire alliance architecture depended on nobody proving. That operational independence and genuine partnership are not mutually exclusive, that the dependency embedded in American defense platforms was never a technical necessity. It was a structural preference. Designed into software pipelines, sustainment contracts, and weapons authorization protocols across 5 decades of alliance management, not because interoperability required it, because influence depended on it. Finland is running that calculation right now. Norway is running it. Every mid-sized NATO partner currently operating inside an American-controlled defense ecosystem is quietly asking the same question Ottawa asked, and watching Canada's experience to understand what the answer costs, not which jet Canada chooses. What Canada's resistance reveals about the architecture itself. Ending the contract remains unsigned. The pressure from Washington continues, but the moment that cannot be reversed has already passed. Canada named the kill switch, out loud. Where allies were listening. 50 years of diplomatic language had kept that dependency carefully nameless. Canada named it anyway, and that single act changed the terms of every alliance negotiation that follows. Finland is watching. Norway is watching. Every NATO partner locked inside an American-controlled defense ecosystem is running the same calculation Ottawa just completed. The question is not which jet Canada selects. It is whether Washington understands what its own response revealed. Whether an alliance can function when one partner holds the keys to the other's national defense. Canada is not asking Washington to disappear. Canada is asking Washington to share the keys. That answer will define this alliance for the next 50 years. Subscribe for deep dives into the power shifts mainstream coverage buries. The next chapter is already being written, in capitals that are not Washington.